Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in. It's so fun to see where everyone is at around the city and far beyond, I'm seeing in the chat as well. And thank you to Sergio and the Toronto Public Library for having us all. I'm incredibly excited to start a whole new lunchtime lecture series today. Over the summer, we did Toronto's most notorious. For the fall, we're doing Toronto's most scandalous because Toronto's history is filled with tons of these stories from, as we're going to do next month, political intrigues, some big celebrity scandals, some tycoons and robber barons in a couple of months as well. But today we're going to start with Toronto's most scandalous love affairs. And my approach to the lecture series is to sort of vaguely a little bit go in chronological order. And the early history of Toronto as a city and as the muddy little town of York is just filled with stories of scandalous love affairs. So today, that's what we're going to be focusing on. We're going to look at Toronto sort of in the late 1700s, early 1800s, an era when love affairs could spark sort of political turmoil themselves, duels, riots, all sorts of drama linked to these love stories, some of which are from my own Toronto Book of Love and are among my very favorite stories to tell. And since we're sort of starting back at the sort of early era of Toronto as a city, I thought this is the image that we could start with. It's one of my favorite images to start talks with, but I think I didn't get to use it through all Toronto's most notorious. This is what Toronto looked like the week that it was founded. It's painted by the governor's wife, Elizabeth Simcoe, right at the end of July in 1793. So it gives us this glimpse into the city's founding moment. People, as Sergio mentioned, had already been living here for thousands and thousands of years. First Nations and their ancestors, the Mississaugas, when the Simcoes and the other settlers arrived. This is the moment they showed up to start building the city that became the metropolis we live in today. We're looking sort of west across the waterfront here. These forests are what's now downtown Toronto. We're looking from sort of vaguely around sort of where the Portlands are today. And you can see some of the details that show us what was going on that week. At the mouth of a creek they called the Garrison, some of Simcoe's soldiers, the Queen's Rangers, on this week in 1793, had already pitched their tents and started clearing away some of the big old trees. So these white squares and triangles here are those tents pitched at the mouth of that creek where they were starting to build Fort York, which is the very first bit of the city under construction. And over on the left, you can see the masts of the British warships that have brought them over from the old capital, what's now Niagara on the Lake. So the most recent ship had arrived with Simcoe himself on board, including much of his family. You can see the ship in the distance there in this image by C.W. Jeffreys. That's HMS Mississauga, and Simcoe having rowed ashore to start his new town, meeting some of the Anishinaabe leaders. This, I believe, shows us Chief Kanice, an Ojibwe leader who Simcoe knew pretty well through their interactions. When Simcoe arrived to found Toronto, what he called the town of York, this little muddy outpost on the northern shores of Lake Ontario, he had already declared that morality was going to have a big role to play. Simcoe imagined our city being a very conservative, very religious place. He said that all just government was founded on the morality of its people. And he had a very specific idea of morality in mind. Very Protestant, very British, very conservative, as I say. In fact, Simcoe tried to set it up so that only Anglican ministers would be allowed to perform wedding ceremonies. And he mostly got his way. There were just a few other exceptions. If you were a Methodist, for instance, you would be allowed to. But if you were Catholic or Jewish or at a First Nations ceremony, for decades in Toronto, it wasn't clear whether your wedding actually legally counted at all. So Simcoe had this very sort of restrictive vision of what would be allowed, and he hoped to hold his settlers and their morality, including their romantic lives, to this very particular standard he had in mind. But right from the very beginning, the settlers in the town of York would fail to live up to that vision for the city. As one historian put it, within a couple of decades or so, the very air of York was fetid with scandal. And so we have lots of stories to choose from when we're looking for the city's most scandalous early love affairs. In fact, some of Simcoe's own closest allies were caught up in some of this drama. So there's 6 love affairs I really want to tell you about today. And the first 3 of them are all featuring men from this painting. This is the very first government of what's now Ontario, what was Upper Canada back then. That's Simcoe standing in the foreground with his big hat and his sword and the papers in his hand. And this is the government that was a combination of elected representatives and people he handpicked himself. And lots of them were caught up in scandal, including Simcoe's right-hand man. In this painting, very literally, he's standing by his right hand, symbolically. This is Thomas Talbot, who is Simcoe's own personal secretary. And everywhere Simcoe went in this new colony that he was setting up, Talbot would almost always be there with him. And they weren't alone. Often Simcoe's wife and family was there with him. As I say, Simcoe didn't show up alone. It wasn't just him and his soldiers. He brought most of his family with him too, including his wife Elizabeth, who painted that painting of the harbor the week the city was founded. You can see them here with their son Francis, who Castle Frank is named in honor of, being held by Chief Kenice. And behind them, you can even see the tent that they lived in on our waterfront as construction on Fort York was getting started. And Elizabeth Simcoe, she had a huge role to play in early Toronto as well. They were living in this big, fancy, really pair of tents they called the Canvas House that had wallpapered walls and wooden floors that would fold out. And while Simcoe was setting up the government and preparing for the threat of an American invasion, Elizabeth, she was tasked with recording what was happening and sort of importing British social life to what to them was sort of the edge of the known world. And so a lot of our knowledge of this period comes from Elizabeth's own diary and her paintings. And she writes a lot about the things she was doing to try to make this sort of an upper class British social system. She was trying to import the kind of drawing room and ballroom culture that they knew back home on their country estate. They'd have been at some of the same parties probably that Jane Austen was at, certainly had mutual friends in common. And even here, living in this tent, Elizabeth Simcoe was throwing dinners and dances and balls, card parties with all the most influential couples in town and across the colony. But at the same time that Elizabeth was sort of trying to import this very prim and proper, genteel British upper class culture, she was also enjoying a lot of freedoms here that she didn't get to enjoy back home, where there were such strict social rules, especially for a gentlewoman like Elizabeth Simcoe. So her diary is also filled with moments of her sort of pushing the boundaries of acceptable behavior. She's going on long horseback rides through the forests, exploring, climbing into canoes. She's poking rattlesnakes with a stick and eating raccoon meat. Strangest of all, Elizabeth Simcoe even becomes a bit of a pyromaniac while she's here. All across the eastern half of what's now Canada, Elizabeth Simcoe starts setting fires just to watch them burn. She'd seen some settlers burning trees outside Quebec City to clear the land. She loved the way the smoke hung in the branches of the trees. She seems to have loved the look of flames. And so everywhere she went, she was setting fires just to give herself that pleasant of experience of getting to watch things burn. And she put it in her diary, or a letter, I think, maybe she sent back home to her best friend. She said, "Perhaps you have no idea of the pleasure of walking in a burning wood, but I found it so great that I think I shall have some woods set on fire for my evening walks," which she absolutely did. And it's the kind of thing that she never could have done back home on her country estate in Devon without causing a huge stir and a massive scandal. But here at Toronto, at York, she could do things she couldn't do back home. And that included playing with some metaphorical fire as well. Because as I say, everywhere Simcoe went, his personal secretary, Thomas Talbot, was there too, which meant that Thomas and Elizabeth ended up spending a lot of time alone. In fact, almost all of the most romantic moments in Elizabeth's diary are moments she spent not with her husband, except for one romantic walk through the heights of Quebec City. Other than that, they all seem to be shared with Thomas Talbot. Her diary is absolutely filled with them. When the ice of the harbor freezes over and they walk out to what's now the islands, it's Thomas Talbot who takes her by the arm so she doesn't slip on the ice. When she's upset by the sight of some passenger pigeons in a cage in a market squawking and flapping away, it's Thomas Talbot who pays to have them released so she won't be upset. He brings her gifts back from the meetings that he and Simcoe have with Indigenous leaders. They have dinner together. They tease each other as he's climbing awkwardly into a canoe. It's Elizabeth's there to make fun of him. And so the whole diary is filled with moments that are incredibly eyebrow-raising at the least. One of them happens out on what's now the islands, which back then was still connected to the mainland. It was just a big sandbar. Elizabeth said they were her favorite place, her favorite sands, as she put it. It's where she set one of her wildfires just to watch it burn. And it's where, on an autumn day in that founding year of 1793, she and Thomas headed out there alone and raced their horses across the sand. It's like something out of a romance novel, and incredibly romantic sounding, and something she never could have done back home, to spend all this time alone with an unmarried man, a dashing young soldier at that. And so historians have been left wondering what was going on. Her source is the diary, so she was open about it, but this is deeply unusual for the time. And it's left people ever since wondering whether there was a romance between Elizabeth and Thomas Talbot. In the end, though, she stuck with her husband. They were only here for a few years in the Canadian colonies before they headed back home across the Atlantic Ocean and returned to England, returned to Devon and to their country estate there in the West Country. Wolford Lodge is still there today. It's a retirement community now, and it's where they spent the rest of their lives together. For John, it didn't last too long. He was caught up in the wars against Napoleon, ended up dying, having been sent to Portugal on a ship that had been freshly painted with toxic paint. And Simcoe suffered from horrible asthma. He was so sick by the time he reached Lisbon that they decided to send him straight home, which they did on the same ship painted with that toxic paint. By the time he got home to Exeter, he only had a few days left to live. Elizabeth, she led a long life. She stayed there at Wolford Lodge in Devon for decades to come and grew old, remaining true to her husband's memory the whole time, never got remarried. And when she died, she was buried right next to her husband beneath a little chapel, Wolford Chapel, that they built on their land. It's still there today, and you can still go visit the Simcoe's graves. Some of their children are buried there with them. And if you do, you'll notice that there's this Canadian flag flying outside. and the blue and gold of an Ontario heritage plaque there. And that's because this little patch of land, just the little bit where the chapel sits, is officially Canadian territory. But even though it's surrounded by the English countryside, this little patch of land was actually given to the province of Ontario by England. I think it was in the 1960s, so that the Simcoes rest in the soil of the province that they helped to found. And so they stayed together, not just for their lives, but for eternity. While Thomas Talbot, while he stayed single for the rest of his life, he stayed in what's now Ontario and became a big figure in the history of the area west of us, around London. You'll see his name on roads like Colonel Talbot Road, because he was put in charge of settling the area, sort of handing out the free land that the British were taking from Indigenous people and handing out to settlers, making Talbot incredibly powerful. But even though he was this big central figure, he was also very much a loner. He lived in his little cabin, which you can see there on the right, on a bluff looking out over Lake Erie, and stuck to himself mostly. He'd show up for one big social event a year, but the rest of the time lived basically the life of a hermit. And decades later, toward the end of his life, he got a famous visitor, British writer and feminist Anna Jameson, who stayed with him for a few days and had heard horror stories about what a curmudgeonly old misogynist he was. But when she arrived, he was warm and friendly and gentlemanly and welcomed her with open arms. And it left her wondering why he led this life of a hermit. And when she asked around, people said that they believed that as a young man, Thomas Talbot had fallen deeply in love with a woman who had broken his heart and that he had never recovered. We'll never know who that woman was for sure, but some historians have certainly wondered whether it's true that he and Elizabeth were doing more than just riding their horses and that they had really fallen in love, at least Thomas had. And so that's just one of the three stories you'll find are connected to this painting. Another one is Simcoe's Attorney General. This guy over here is John White. So the top lawyer in the province, the first Attorney General of what's now Ontario. He was tasked with importing British law to this place. But John White would end up dying breaking the very laws he was meant to enforce. And it all started at a Christmas party in 1799. This was just a few years after the town had been founded. It was still just a muddy little outpost. They didn't even have a church yet. But what they did have was plenty of squabbling government officials and some more scandalous love affairs as well. This one all started with this woman, who I know you can tell just by looking at her what a troublemaker Elizabeth Small was. She was married to another government official, and she was at a Christmas party involving that official, her own husband and the Whites as well. So John White, the Attorney General, his wife, I think her name was Mary Ann, was there as well. And at one point, Mary Ann said hello to Elizabeth Small. And Elizabeth Small, get this, I'm going to give you a moment. Brace yourselves. It's unbelievably scandalous. Elizabeth Small did not say hello back. I'll give you a moment to recover. This snub was earth-shattering news in this tiny little outpost. And John White was offended on his wife's behalf, who had been snubbed by Elizabeth Small. So the next day, he showed up at the Smalls' house, Berkeley House, which there's Berkeley Street in the East End-ish. That's named in honor of their home, which stood where the new Globe and Mail building is today. And John White demanded an explanation for this snub. And when he didn't get it, he headed to a friend to complain. He told this friend that part of the reason he was so upset is that Elizabeth Small wasn't just any woman. Elizabeth Small was his own former mistress. Now, these kinds of extramarital affairs were actually not uncommon in the town of York. The town's first Anglican minister said there were at least 6 of what he called kept mistresses in town. In fact, John White is said to have had more than one mistress. In addition to Elizabeth Small, he was sleeping with another woman he had a whole secret second family with. And so there was a lot of reason to believe that he was telling the truth about Elizabeth Small, that they had been having an affair, which was shocking enough an admission. But John White didn't even stop there. He said that he had dumped Elizabeth Small and that the reason he'd broken up with her is that she was sleeping with so many other men in town, he was afraid of catching a sexually transmitted disease. Unbelievable sort of rumor fodder. Thankfully, John White's friend promised not to tell anyone else. Well, maybe just one other person, if that was okay. And so over the course of that holiday season, starting with that Christmas party, this scandal tore through the town. And by the time the new year arrived, Elizabeth Small's husband, John Small, they're all Johns and Elizabeths back then, well, he seems to have had no choice but to try to defend his wife's honor by doing what all gentlemen thought was the most honorable and reasonable thing to do when a question of honor was involved, which was to challenge John White to a duel, to settle their dispute by heading out into a field, standing a few meters away from each other, and trying to shoot each other dead. You know, like gentlemen. And so that's what happened. On the 3rd day of the 1800s, a January morning at dawn, John White and John Small headed out into a field out back of the old Parliament buildings on Front Street, right toward the foot of Esplanade and Parliament today. That's why it's Parliament Street, right next to where the distillery is today. And they took up their positions a few meters away from each other in that wintry field at dawn. Their seconds counted down, and then they took their shots. Now, John White, he doesn't seem to have had particularly good aim with his pistol because his bullet missed John Small completely, but John Small seems to have had better aim. His ball hit John White, the Attorney General, square in the torso, tore through his body, and lodged in his spine. It was a fatal wound. John White was carried off to a friend's house nearby. Russell Abbey, Peter Russell, a big government official, lived. He was also one of the people in Toronto history who enslaved people as well. The Pompadours, Peggy, her children Amy, Jupiter, and Millie were all enslaved here at Russell Abbey, at Peter Russell's country estate, Petersfield. And it was here at the Abbey that John White died, 36 painful hours later of this bullet lodged in his spine. John Small, therefore, was arrested. Duels were illegal, and he was put on trial for murder. But upper Canadian juries were seen to be particularly lenient ones. No one had ever been convicted of murder, and people did look favorably on duels. They seemed to think they were the reasonable way to settle these disputes, as long as they were done by the standards they found honorable. And so John Small was acquitted and released and paid no legal price for having killed the Attorney General in that duel. Instead, the Smalls would pay a social price. This whiff of scandal, I mean, it was more than a whiff, they reeked of it, was enough to get them ostracized from polite society. They were no longer invited to all the best dinners and dances and balls. In fact, there was one woman in town in particular who took it upon herself to enforce these strict social codes. Anne Murray Powell was kind of the matriarch of York. She oversaw the social scene and made sure that anyone who was ever accused of infidelity was no longer welcome at these big social events, like the big balls that they held. And so the Smalls were kind of cast out and spent much of the rest of their life living quietly at Berkeley House, missing out on all the best parties. Even years later, when Elizabeth Small tried to attend a big ball in the spring, I think it was Queen Charlotte's ball, with the support of a new governor, when she got there, she discovered that Anne Marie Powell was boycotting the event and got the governor's wife to do the same. Even now, Elizabeth Small was banished years after the duel. And even though we'll never know for sure whether she and John White were even having that affair or whether he was just lying to smear her reputation. The women who realized they were at this party that was being boycotted by Anne Marie Powell, the second they realized that was happening, called for their sleighs and rushed off into the night, ditching the party in order never to be seen in public with Elizabeth Small and risk their own reputations by association. That's the kind of power Anne Marie Powell wielded over the town. And that's despite the fact that Anne Marie Powell herself had a scandalous past. And in fact, the Powell family is arguably one of the most scandalous families in the entire history of our city. And as I know you all know, we've set a pretty high bar for that, even in recent years. And so that brings us to the third person in this painting, because one of the men here, is in fact Anne Marie Powell's own husband. This is William Dummer Powell, another big legal figure in Toronto history. He would eventually become Chief Justice, the top judge in all of what's now Ontario. And he and Anne Marie Powell, they had met as teenagers when they were both living in Boston in the late 1700s. They had fallen in love so deeply that they were determined to spend the rest of their lives together. They got engaged to be married, but their families thought they were too young to go through with the marriage since they were still teenagers. And so they were forbidden from doing it until they got older. And they agreed to this, but they made a promise to each other that if they were ever going to be separated, they would elope, run away, and get married in secret so that they could never be torn apart. And they made this promise just before the American Revolution broke out. And Anne Marie Powell and William Dummer Powell, they were deeply loyalist, deeply loyal to Britain and the British Empire. And so Boston, which became a hotbed of revolutionary activity, was too dangerous a city for them to live in. They had to flee as refugees. They were going to be separated. And so they kept the promise they had made to each other. They fled in secret and got married despite the fact that their families had forbidden it from happening. And as a result, their families basically disowned them. Anne's aunt, who she lived with in Boston, couldn't take the hit on her reputation by having them stay with her. William's family in England wasn't interested in taking them in either. And so it seems that that's how the Powells ended up living here in what's now Toronto. In fact, they arrived before the Simcoes even did. They were among the first settlers in what's now Ontario. And I suspect that's partly because they were looking to live somewhere they could make a new start. And so they moved to what to the British was the edge of the known world, somewhere people didn't know about their scandalous background. And when the town of York was founded, they were among the first to move here too as part of the new settlement. They lived in this house right downtown where the Royal York Hotel is today and became centers of social life. They threw so many parties that they actually once had a shelf collapse under the weight of all the booze that they were storing on it for all the parties they were throwing. And they implemented their vision of propriety on everyone else. While William Dummer Powell was the top judge in the province, Anne Marie Powell was the matriarch ruling over the social scene. Some might say hypocritically, since she did have that scandalous origin story for her own marriage. And their children failed to live up to those standards as well. One of their sons eloped himself and then drowned in the Niagara River. Another one, they worried, would never marry. A third actually ended up heading south to the Caribbean, became close associates with the new ruler of Haiti until that ruler, who was no stranger to killing a few people, when they crossed him, discovered that the Powell's son was selling him fake gold. And so their son then got on the next ship out of Haiti, which turned out to be a ship bound for the Venezuelan Revolution, which was crushed, and their son, Jeremiah, arrested on piracy charges for being part of this Venezuelan revolution, ended up being thrown into a South American prison until his dad was able to pull every string he could to get him freed, at which point he just headed back out into the seas and disappeared forever. No one's entirely sure what happened to Jeremiah Powell, but by the time he was gone, he had deeply disgraced the family in all of this sort of succession of scandals. And Jeremiah wasn't even the most scandalous one of the Powell children. It was their daughter, Anne Powell, without the Murray, who was the most scandalous of them all. And that's thanks to her own big love. Growing up, Anne had fallen in love with her dad's protege, this guy, John Beverly Robinson. He too would become Chief Justice one day, and Attorney General as well. He lived in, was I saying Berkeley House or Beverly House for the Smalls? The Smalls are in Berkeley House, Berkeley Street. Robinson lived in Beverly House, out by Beverly Street. All these Johns, all these Berkeleys and Beverleys get mixed up in my head from time to time. But Anne loved John Beverly Robinson deeply, and growing up, they spent all sorts of time together. Everyone in town expected them to get married. But in the end, that's not what happened. John Beverly Robinson went on a trip to England and came back married. He had met Emma Walker on that trip, fallen in love deeply and quickly, and gotten married in this sort of whirlwind romance, which absolutely shattered Anne Powell, who had expected to marry him herself. Her mental health from that point on suffered horribly. It seems she might have even suffered something like a schizophrenic break. She displayed deeply strange and obsessive behavior after that, became something of a stalker even. And it was made worse by her mom's conservative views. Her mom in Boston had been forced to work in a hat shop. She found that incredibly demeaning. And it was part of a new generation of women who thought that women shouldn't work. And so Anne, who wanted to go work as a school teacher to distract herself from a broken heart, wasn't allowed to. Her mother wouldn't let her. And so she had nothing to do but obsess over John Beverly Robinson, follow the couple around town. The Robinson family told a story passed down for generations about one night when John and Emma came back from a night out to find Anne Powell in their home. This is actually a photo of their front hallway taken years later, and found Anne inside their baby's room, hovering over the crib. Absolutely disturbing stuff. And it didn't stop there. One winter, the Robinsons headed out on a trip to England, probably go visit Emma's family there. And the Powells were so worried their daughter was going to follow them and continue stalking them that they locked her in her room at their house. And not even that stopped her. She was so determined to follow the Robinsons that she managed to break out of her room and hire a sleigh to chase them through the wintry wilds of upstate New York, all the way down to New York City. I think when they checked into a hotel hours later, Anne Powell would arrive. And that happened at the docks in New York City, too. John Beverly Robinson had to tell the captain of their ship not to let Anne on board because they were being followed by their stalker. The captain made good on that promise, didn't let Anne on board, which meant that Anne Powell was forced instead to take the very next ship. She didn't give up. She just boarded the next vessel bound for England and continued chasing them across the Atlantic, all the way to the waters off the coast of Ireland, which is when her ship, the Albion, was caught in a terrible storm, and it was smashed against the rocks, the cliffs of the Irish coast. A horrible, tragic shipwreck. We know Anne's final moments were spent helping the crew try to pump water out of the doomed vessel, even though it was too late, and that when the ship was broken into pieces, she clung to the wreckage before she was taken under the waves and drowned. It was such a big, famous shipwreck that people even wrote songs about it. This one, Loss of the Albion, even mentions Anne Powell by name. The news was absolutely heartbreaking for Anne Marie Powell. She had lost her daughter, but on top of that, she had also lost the good family name. Her daughter had died, maybe the single most scandalous death in Toronto history, died in a shipwreck stalking a man across the ocean who was already married. And so Anne Marie Powell decided to sort of do the same thing to herself she had done to Elizabeth Small. Anne Marie Powell ostracized herself from all of the best dinners and dances and balls, and no longer accepted invitations that she could possibly avoid, deciding that the Powell name had been ruined. And didn't even end there. Many years later, Anne Marie Powell's granddaughter would be caught up in another big scandal. Elizabeth Stuart, her granddaughter, had moved to London, Ontario, had married the grandson of the town of York's first Anglican minister, which was on paper a very good match, two leading families united through marriage. But in practice, it was anything but. Elizabeth Stuart never really loved her husband, and it was just a matter of time before she fell in love with someone else, for real this time. His name was John Grogan. He was a soldier who'd been sent here in the wake of the big rebellions in the 1830s, Mackenzie's rebellion in Toronto. They were stationed, these soldiers sent here to keep an eye on things after the unrest in London for a while, and then they were sent to Toronto. They turned Osgoode Hall into soldiers' barracks for a while. So we'd have soldiers keeping an eye on things not far from the heart of the city. And Elizabeth Stuart didn't want to say goodbye to John Grogan, who she had just fallen in love with, so she followed him here. She left her family, her husband and children in London, and came to Toronto and spent a night at Osgoode Hall with John Grogan, not even bothering to keep it very secret at all. And it sparked another huge scandal. Everyone knew she had spent this night with her soldier away from her husband, and her husband ended up being put in a similar position that John Small had been decades earlier. He ended up challenging John Grogan to a duel and sued for divorce. No one in Toronto history had ever gotten divorced before. It was an incredibly difficult thing to do. You needed an individual act of parliament to be passed here at the Parliament buildings, the new ones on Front Street, where the CBC building is now. You needed Parliament to pass an individual act to approve your individual divorce, which means that the Powell family's dirty laundry was literally debated openly in Parliament, and when the bill passed, it had to be given royal assent from Queen Victoria herself. And so it was a Powell who became the first to get a divorce in the entire history of our city and had to have Queen Victoria sign off on it. Absolutely mortifying for Anne Marie Powell, who by then was toward the end of her life. Now, that's the end of those love affairs I wanted to tell you about linked to that painting. But there are three more I'm going to try to squeeze in before our lunch hour is over. And the city had so many of these scandalous love affairs that Sellers actually had some ways of trying to smooth over some of the unease that they caused. One of them included one of the early marriages in the town of York. It was in 1802 that Eugenia Wilcox got married. She was the daughter of the first postmaster of York, and she was marrying an aristocrat by the name of Augustin Boiton de Fougères, who was himself French. It was an unusual wedding, uniting these two different cultures. Eugenia was from an Anglophone Irish family. Her father, before coming here, had been the mayor of Cork in Ireland, while Fougères, he was very much French, a French royalist in the days of the French Revolution. People like Fougères who were having their heads lopped off by guillotines the very same time Toronto was founded. The Reign of Terror started the same year that the Simcoes arrived to start building the town of York. Fougères had stayed loyal to the monarchy, had joined an army looking to put down the French Revolution, but that had been a disaster, and he, like many French aristocrats, was forced to flee France as a refugee. Some of them came here to Toronto. The Simcoes met with some of them, and they tried to start a French royalist community of their own up Yonge Street, up Markham, Richmond Hill area, if I'm remembering correctly. And Fougères was one of them. And so he and Eugenia seem to have fallen deeply in love and made this cross-cultural match, but in a town like York that was so deeply British and had such deeply conservative views about love, this match seems to have made some people uneasy, the Francophone and Anglophone, the Protestant and Catholic coming together. And so people here turned to an ancient tradition that people used to settle this kind of marital unease. It began the night of their wedding, when people in the town of York drew on this centuries-old tradition that has been handed down to us from many, many centuries ago. It began in France, it seems, where people on nights of particularly contentious weddings began having sort of mini riots as a way of settling that unease. People would show up to the marital home, wherever the newly married couple was spending the night, with everything they could get their hands on that would make a racket. Trumpets and horns and drums and guns and pots and pans they could bang together. They would arrive at the newlyweds' home and make the biggest racket they possibly could, demanding that they come out and bribe them, pay them off with booze, and then they would go away and sort of have hazed in the new couple with this unsettling marriage. And they became known as charivaris, though there are some different pronunciations. I think some people even say it chivalry. And it was this tradition for centuries and centuries. They were taken very seriously in a lot of places. And the French and other Europeans, as they crossed the ocean, brought the tradition of the charivari with them. And so it became popular in New France. And then when Toronto was founded, it was imported here as well. And so when Eugenia and Augustin got married that fall night in 1802, that's what the townspeople of York did. They performed a charivari. And that night, they crept through the town with every noise-making device they could get their hands on and headed to Eugenia's father's home, where the newlyweds were sleeping that night. And they burst into this raucous cacophony of noise. As one eyewitness put it, such a noise with drums, kettles, cowbells, and horns was never before heard at York. They kept it up past midnight, all round the town. But charivaris could also go wrong. Sometimes when the couple refused to come out, the riders would get up on the roofs and cover the chimney to smoke the couple out. If they still refused, sometimes things could even turn violent. These crowds were known to assault married couples, to tar and feather them, to tie them to rails. Sometimes there was sexual violence. In St. Catherine's, they used a charivari as a cover to murder a black man they knew perfectly well wasn't the groom. And so sometimes people defended themselves as well. Sometimes people being attacked by a charivari crowd would fire with guns into the crowd. More than one person was left dead after a Canadian charivari. And this one in the town of York seems to have been deeply tense. That night, her father, her brother, and her brother-in-law all came out onto the front porch with loaded rifles. Her brother-in-law, William Warren Baldwin, had married her sister. He was an influential figure in town as well. And with their rifles loaded, they threatened to shoot the charivari revelers if they didn't disperse. And that night, they did. But the very next night, they were back and continued. And then the night after that as well, even as it rained, they continued making these rocket noises outside the home. It wasn't until the fourth night that things finally ended, when they started messing with Wilcox's hay stacks. He found that it was the final straw, a pun very much intended, and threatened them so seriously that they decided to disperse, and this time to never come back. And so the most dangerous charivari in Toronto history finally came to an end. As for the newlyweds, their life together had started off in dramatic fashion and sadly wouldn't last much longer than that. Eugenia sadly died just a couple of years later, and with nothing holding him here, and with the situation in France changing as Napoleon came to power, it was no longer as dangerous to be an aristocrat anymore. No longer afraid of the guillotine, Augustin Boiton de Fougères decided to leave Upper Canada behind and return to France. He wasn't alone. A lot of those French aristocrats found that life in the Canadian bush was a little more difficult than life in the French salons they were used to, and so that settlement eventually dissolved as well. But the charivaris, they continued, and they started being adapted to new purposes. In Quebec, in lower Canada, they became used as a ritual means of protest in the lead up to the big rebellion in 1837. And so charivaris became a means of politics as well. And that was happening in France too. In fact, there was a whole new magazine, Le Charivari, that was dedicated to criticizing the monarchy and corrupt government officials in France. And even in the 1960s, it was being used by Algerians fighting against French colonial rule there. In South and Latin America, in more recent decades, the same tradition has become known as the cacerolazo, as people head into the streets, smashing pans, making a riot as a way of protesting against corrupt leaders there. In fact, in Montreal in 2012, when students headed into the streets to protest against laws cracking down on protests, they too grabbed their pots and pans and made a racket, became known as the casserole. And in even more recent memory, when we found ourselves in lockdown in 2020 and 2021, it was that same tradition that you can trace back to the charivaris that was used in a more positive light, as people around the world, including in neighborhoods across Toronto, took their pots and pans and banged them this time as a sign of hope and solidarity and a moment of thanks for the healthcare workers on the front lines helping to save our lives. In Toronto, there were plenty of scandalous love affairs tied up with the history of those 1830s rebellions as well. So I'm going to very quickly try to go through a couple of them before we're done today. The leader of the rebellion in Toronto, William Lyon Mackenzie, who had already by then served a term as our first ever mayor, he had his own scandalous romantic past. That's part of how he ended up here in the first place. He had grown up in Scotland and was continually getting into trouble, a hard drinker, hard gambler, who ended up having a child out of wedlock. He and the woman that he had slept with were forced to take the baby to church and admit all their sins, all this adultery in front of the whole community in order for the church to agree to have the child christened. And so it was in part trying to sort of start fresh that Mackenzie left Scotland and that scandalous past behind and moved here, though he brought his son with him eventually. His mom actually brought him over along with a new wife, Isabel, who would be at William's side through all of the tumultuous events of the rebellion. And when the rebellion was crushed, government supporters used the potential of scandal to help crack down on dissent. Anyone who was suspected of supporting the rebellion was rounded up, thrown into prison. 2 of the rebels were hanged, but the crackdown didn't stop there. One of these episodes took place at the Parliament buildings on Front Street, the same ones where the Powell's Dirty Laundry was aired. There was one night that a housekeeper at the Parliament buildings, Mary Powell, no relation to the other Powells as far as I know, was standing outside one politician's office, Markland. George Markland was a big government supporter, a member of the family compact. That night, he was working late, as he often did. Powell had noticed this before. And that night, she heard some strange sounds coming from inside the office. First, the murmur of voices, low enough that she couldn't hear what they were saying, but could tell that Markland was one of them. And then a series of noises that she would later describe as ones that gave her the distinct impression that, as she put it, there was a female in the room with whom some person was in connection. In other words, what she was hearing was very clearly a romantic rendezvous in Markland's office after hours inside the Parliament buildings. She waited outside to see who came out, but when someone did come out of Markland's office, she was shocked to discover that it wasn't a woman at all. It was a man, a drummer, military drummer from Fort York, came rushing down the steps past her, followed not too long after by Markland himself. Powell, the housekeeper, was, as I say, shocked by this and confronted Markland about it immediately, said, not knowing what she was saying would have deeper meaning later, told him, well, sir, these are queer doings from the bottom to the top. No more came of it that night, but in daylight, she decided to press the issue. And so she gave George Markland a letter warning him that she worried his reputation was on the line. As I say, the town of York was a place, now the city of Toronto, with incredibly restrictive views on love. In fact, by the letter of the law at the time, homosexuality was punishable by death. The British had imported these deeply conservative laws, which is a legacy the world's still wrestling with today. More than half of the countries around the world where being gay is a crime are former British colonies. And at this point, Toronto was no exception. And so she told him that she trusted that he wouldn't be offended by this letter, but that she needed to tell him that his movements about the building in the evenings are watched and have become the subject of conjecture. That she had been debating whether to send him this letter or not, but felt that she had to because he was potentially in danger. And in truth, he was. George Markland was an incredibly controversial figure at the time. He'd been around as a big figure for many, many years, a leader of the Tory party, of the conservative movement, a big supporter of the government and the family compact, the small group of Tory elites who kept power in their own hands and cracked down on dissent, the side the rebellion was rising up against. But in the lead up to the rebellion, George Markland had taken a controversial protest action of his own. The new British governor was so conservative, so anti-democratic, and so deaf to any advice from any local people, any Torontonians, that George Markland ended up resigning from his post in protest as one of the governor's advisors that the governor wasn't listening to. It sparked a new election that was one of the most corrupt and most violent in Canadian history and helped lead to the rebellion. So in the wake of the rebellion, it looks like his former friends in the family compact and in the Tory party were looking for revenge. And even though George Markland's private life had been kind of an open secret, it seems, for many years, it wasn't until they were angry at him politically that those enemies decided to turn it into a scandal. Open letters began being written to a new, I believe, governor, decrying George Markland and trying to get him fired. Can it be possible that the government will continue to retain in office a man with such an indelible stain upon his character as the Honorable George H. Markland? An anonymous letter complained, and in a second said there would be an everlasting stigma and disgrace if he was allowed to remain in office. In the end, Markland called for an inquiry. You can find the files at Library and Archives Canada in Ottawa, in this file labeled M. And they did have a huge inquiry. He hoped it would be led by his good friend and ally, the town's first bishop, John Strawn. But in the end, there was a whole council of the governor's advisors who looked into it. They interviewed young men around town about their own relationship with Markland, and they all gave very specific testimony that made it clear that they weren't themselves gay, but that Markland had done things they said made them uncomfortable. We'll never know whether they were telling partial truths or whole truths or no truth at all, whether these were consensual moments that they now needed to distance themselves from in order to save their own reputations and careers and potentially lives. One said that he had been made uncomfortable when Markland at dinner one night told him he had the most perfect figure of anyone in town. A second said that Markland had put his hand on his arm as if he knew him and thought that he'd been out of his mind, while a third complained on his brother's behalf that Markland had put his hand on his brother in an indecent manner. And so this became a big scandal. It even reached New York City, where Mackenzie, the rebel mayor, was living in exile and used his new newspaper to claim that the whole thing was a witch hunt, that Powell, the housekeeper, had clearly been bribed by the family compact to lie about it all, and that they were just looking to score political points. In the end, Markland agreed to a compromise. The inquiry was dropped. There were no criminal charges, thankfully, but Markland was forced to leave Toronto and leave politics behind. He ended up living in, I think, Kingston or Belleville for the rest of his life and had no further huge impact on the history of the colony and its politics. When he died many years later, he barely got a mention in the newspaper at all. By then, there was a new generation of politics. And I know we're at 102 already, so if you have to drop off, I completely understand. But one of my very favorite Toronto scandalous love stories is one I haven't mentioned yet. So I'll just quickly tell it to you before we go. It's one of my favorite stories to tell. So if you've seen me speak before, there's a good chance you've seen me speak about this guy. This is Robert Baldwin. He was an enemy, an opponent of the family compact, who believed in real democracy, in the idea that we needed reform and that the family compact shouldn't have a stranglehold on power. He was the son of William Warren Baldwin, would come out onto the front porch of his father-in-law's house with a rifle the night of that riotous Charivari years earlier. He'd been part of the first generation of settlers to grow up in town, just like George Markland had been, but opposed his politics. Before the rebellion, they had both actually resigned in protest. But Baldwin, in the wake of the rebellion, became the leader of the movement against the family compact, the leader of the Reform Party. With the rebellion crushed, all the most radical reformers were gone. They'd been hanged or driven into exile or tried and convicted and banished. And so it was only the moderate reformers, the one who didn't believe in violence, who were left over, the ones who wanted peaceful moves toward Canadian democracy, toward the system we have today, responsible government. Basically, the idea that Parliament should be the ultimate power. The government ministers should answer to Parliament, be responsible to them, to elected representatives, instead of being responsible to the British governor and basically to the family compact. Baldwin became the central champion of this idea. As I say, he'd been part of the first generation of settlers to grow up in Toronto. He had gone to Bishop Strawn's school, a little blue schoolhouse right downtown, and that's where he started falling in love. Robert Baldwin was a deeply romantic teenager. He had new crushes all the time, was falling in love with all the young girls of York, and he'd write letters about it to his best friend, James Hunter Sampson. They had met at the Blue Schoolhouse, but James had moved to Belleville, and they carried on their friendship through letters, which is how we know about Robert Baldwin's crushes. He'd write about them in these letters. We think these letters must have been heartbreaking to James, especially the one Baldwin wrote when he fell in love for the final time. He is now in love with the love of his life. And James, we think, was heartbroken by that news because he himself was in love with Robert Baldwin. He wrote back that she could never love Robert as much as he, James, did. Though we'll never know for sure what was going on, because again, it was all so illegal at the time. But for Baldwin, this was a wonderful era. He had fallen in love for the final time. His crush was a woman named Eliza Sullivan. They were head over heels for each other, but there were some problems with this relationship, two things that made it scandalous. One was their age difference. Robert Baldwin by now was in his 20s. Eliza was still a teenager and not an old one at that. And even in the early 1800s, that age difference was enough to make people deeply uncomfortable. And maybe even worse than that, Eliza was also Robert's first cousin. And even in the early 1800s, people were not okay with that level of incest either. And so their families decided to try to break them up. I always say families, but I should say family because they were so closely related. It was the same people who decided to send Eliza away to New York City to live with some relatives there, hoping the distance and time apart would break them up. Robert was always falling in love. He'd have some new crush soon, and the whole thing would be forgotten. I think seriously underestimating the appeal of forbidden love to someone like Robert Baldwin. And so instead of forgetting about each other, that distance just brought them more closely together. They sent a whirlwind of letters back and forth between Toronto and New York. His are filled with pretty schmaltzy stuff. He's lounging on a couch by an open window with the scent of lilacs, making him think of her. They arranged a time every month when they would both think about each other so that they'd feel close over all that distance. And in the end, their family just gave up. Eliza was allowed to move back to Toronto, and she and Robert got married in a very low-key wedding ceremony at the old St. James Church, this little wooden building that stood in the same spot where St. James Cathedral stands today. They didn't make a big deal of it, tried to keep things, pretty quiet since it was so scandalous. Poor James Hunter Sampson had to serve as Robert's groomsman, maybe the worst day of his life. He went on from there to have his own unhappy marriage and drank himself to death in his 30s. A tragic story. In fact, he became, for the rest of his life, one of the most conservative politicians in the colony, opposing everything that Robert Baldwin believed in. But for the Baldwins, they were deliriously happy. They write about what a wonderful time this was. Robert started his legal and political career. They started having children. But the early 1800s, it's still an incredibly dangerous time to give birth. And while the first 3 births all seemed to have gone well, the 4th one was more complicated. Eliza needed a cesarean section, and the incision, the wound, never healed. It became infected, and Eliza died after a long, painful struggle with the infection, leaving Robert deeply heartbroken for the rest of his life. And so while he was fighting for responsible government, for Canadian democracy, sometimes dangerous, draining battles, he was also suffering from bouts of severe depression. The worst was the anniversary of our wedding, when he would wander the streets of Toronto like a ghost, visiting the landmarks of their relationship. St. James Church, the new building that had built on the spot where they got married, their old house on Front Street, all the way up the Davenport Hill, the place where his family had their summer home, the old Spadina house, where the museum stands today, next to Casa Loma, with that view out over the hill over the city. Her room was waiting there for him, untouched, like a shrine. No one else was allowed to go in it. He had kept it unchanged since she died. And she was waiting there too, in the family's tomb, where he could go visit her grave. He longed to join her himself, and it wasn't long after winning the battle for responsible government that that wish of his came true. He passed away, I think in his 50s. They had a huge public funeral at the new St. James Cathedral, the same one we still have today. He was led up to Spadina House and laid to rest in that same family tomb. It wasn't until, I think, a couple of weeks later that one of his relatives found the list. It was a note found in one of his old pockets of a jacket or a vest that laid out his final requests, what he wanted done when he died. And some of those requests were very touching, sweet things. He wanted to be buried with the same love letters that he had always kept inside his jacket pocket right there next to his heart, with a locket that she'd given him as a gift as well. But some of those requests were deeply weird. For instance, he wanted his coffin to be chained to Eliza's coffin so that he'd know they'd be together for eternity, connected by these chains. And even weirder than that, Robert Baldwin said that he wanted his corpse to be given the same kind of cesarean section incision that had killed his wife. And he was very clear that he wanted this done even if he had already died. And so weeks after Baldwin was laid to rest in the family tomb, some relatives had to descend back down into it with a doctor and a scalpel, crack open his coffin, split open his corpse, and then shut it back closed and wrap it in chains so that his final requests would all be carried out. That tomb still exists today. It's no longer at Spadina House. It was eventually moved to St. James Cemetery, right across from St. Jamestown, not too far from Castle Frank subway station, looking out over the Rosedale Ravine. And you'll still find the Baldwin family tomb there near the back, right by the hillside. And you can stand above the entrance to the tomb and know you're standing above the champion of Canadian democracy, chained to the bones of the woman he loved. So I want to thank you very much for listening to all that, even though I went way over time. As Sergio mentioned, we are back together next month for Toronto's most scandalous political intrigue, which is going to be filled with some more deliciously scandalous stories, these ones carried out by politicians. That's going to be Friday at noon, at lunch hour, just like this, free just like this, happening on October 10th. And if you'd like more from me in other forms, I've also got a couple of walking tours coming up I thought I'd mention. This Sunday, I'm doing one all about stories of death and disaster on the waterfront. All you have to do is meet at the foot of Yonge Street at 3 p.m. this Sunday. The tour is pay what you can. And a couple of weeks after that, I'm doing one about Toronto's Victorian underworld, all about crooks and criminals and con artists and thieves. Lots of them stories that we covered during Toronto's Most Notorious, the lecture series we did this summer. And that is also pay what you can. All you have to do is meet outside Union Station on September 27th at 5 p.m. And we'll talk about some of those stories in the places that they happen, which should be lots of fun. I'll leave it up just for one more moment so you can get a screen cap if you like. And you can always follow my stuff online to find out more about those tours as well.